Well, hello and welcome to the third edition of the Labour Future podcast. We're delighted you're able to join us. My name is Brendan Chilton and my co-host is Joe Jervis. Say hi, Joe.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, everyone. And we're delighted today to have John Mills joining us. John is chairman and founder of JML Direct. He's a long-standing Brexit campaigner and most importantly of all, very, very generous contributor and donor to the Labour Party. And we've got John on today. Say hi, John.
Hi there.
Hi, John.
Hello. So we've got John on today to talk about a new initiative that he's launched. John has launched the John Mills Institute for Prosperity, and it has published a report very recently to launch the organisation called Manufacturing a Recovery from Coronavirus. John, welcome to our podcast. Can you just tell us a little bit about the Institute? What's it going to be doing? Why did you set it up?
Well, the Institute is really to promote a whole range of ideas, and they're around getting the British economy to perform better for a whole variety of really very crucial reasons. The record of the British economy over the last 40 years has not been good. If you go back to the 25 years after World War II, the growth rate of the Western economy is about 4%. The last quarter of the 20th century was about 3%. It's recently dropped to about 2%. Now it's down to 1%. And I think there's a real danger that the decade we've got coming up, running up to 2030, is going to see incomes for most people just stagnating or even falling, unless we can get the underlying growth rate of the economy going up. Now, obviously, we've had a big setback with the coronavirus epidemic as well. And we've got to recover the ground that's been lost there. But in addition, we've got a whole lot of other very expensive problems coming down the track. We've got climate change, we've got health costs, we've got social care, we've got education and training costs, which are way down below the OECD average. And if you take into account the cost of remedying all these, or dealing with all these initiatives coming down the track, I think we're in danger of seeing real incomes going down, even possibly by as much as 10% by 2030, unless we can get the underlying growth rate of the UK economy up. So really what the Institute for Prosperity is primarily focused about is trying to get the growth rate up from our current 1 or 1.5% at maximum to somewhere around about 3 or 4%, which is no great big deal. I mean, it's about the world average. And I think there's a whole range of steps that need to be taken to get that done.
It's very interesting, John. In your new report, you've obviously put manufacturing at the heart of this. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yes, I mean, I think manufacturing is the key to getting the growth rate up. And the reason for this is that it's very difficult to get productivity up to any significant extent in the service sector. It's much, much easier to do this in the manufacturing sector. And if you look back to what's happened since the Industrial Revolution started 250 odd years ago, it's really a combination of technology and mechanization and better use of power, which has driven the increase in living standards we've got. And this is largely a range of activity which find their natural home in light industry, although it does spread over to some sections of the service sector too. But our problem is that the amount of our national income which we devote to this sort of investment that produces these returns in manufacturing has just gone down and down and down. And that's largely a function of the fact that we've just deindustrialized over the last 40 years. And so what we're not doing is investing in the future in the way we should do it. That's why our productivity is so static, why the growth rate is so low. And that's what we need to change. And it really is striking to look at the figures for manufacturing. Even as late as 1970, about 30% of our GDP, or even a little more, came from manufacturing. Now it's less than 10%. And this, I think, is by far the biggest single reason why the growth rate has got so much lower than it was. But the reasons for getting back to more manufacturing just aren't simply to do with productivity, although they're very important. There's also another big dimension around the balance in the economy, because deindustrialization has hit the areas outside London much harder than it has the southeast and the London area. And this has left huge areas of the country, but just not enough to sell to the rest of the world to pay their way. And this has a lot to do with the fact that productivity is so much lower outside the London area than it is inside, that you've got huge areas of which require vast subsidies which come from London, and all the austerity that goes with it, the relatively poor job prospects that you get in a lot of the service sector compared to manufacturing. And so there's a whole range of other reasons apart just from productivity why we'd be far better off if we had a better manufacturing base. And just to finish up with the last one, which is crucial, we've got a huge balance of payments problem every year, around about a deficit of around about £100 billion a year. And this is largely driven by the fact that we've got a large deficit also on manufactured goods. And the only way we're ever going to be able to pay our way in the world and close that £100 billion balance of payments gap is selling more goods abroad. We'll never do it with services. So for all these reasons, manufacturing is really crucially important.
John, you once told me, I think it was back in the late 20th century, that the Northeast was wealthier than London because that was the beating heart of Britain, where everything was made, everything was produced, and where we sold everything from. In terms of what we need to do, practical policy measures that an incoming Labour government should adopt, what should a Labour government be doing to, in use of a phrase, level up the economy and to do precisely the things you're calling for in this report? What are the policy changes we need to make?
Well, there's a range of policy changes. Just incidentally, it was in about the 1920s that the south of the country started being richer than the north. Up until then, the north of England was better off because of all the developments in manufacturing there were than the south. And so it's the 1920s, which was a real lost decade for us, which really was the time when the switch started. But go back to your question about what the Labour government should do. I think there are two or perhaps three key areas that it needs to tackle. The first is that we're never going to get manufacturing back to being where it should be in this country, which I think's got to be around about 15% or something of GDP rather than 10%, unless it's profitable. The big problem at the moment is with the exchange rate run largely to benefit the service economy rather than the manufacturing side of it, and the city rather than, again, areas outside the southeast. What's happened is the exchange rate's been too high to make it profitable for a lot of investment to take place in this country. And this is the major reason why we've deindustrialized. So the first thing we've got to do is to change our macroeconomic policy to making sure we have a competitive exchange rate. But that on its own is not going to solve the problem. Because the next thing we need to do is to make sure that there's a huge wave of investment on the back of the new prospects that open up. And the only way of making sure that happens is to make certain that there's enough flow of funds and enough cash available for investors and enough incentives to make the really big change in industrial prospects that we need actually happen. And I think you could get up from 10% to around about 15% of GDP coming from manufacturing in a relatively short period of time. I mean, I think you're probably talking about a minimum of 5 years, but probably not much beyond that. And we're never going to get a huge change like that made unless there's really big financial incentives to make sure that happens. And then on top of that, there's a whole range of complementary policies that we need to put in place on education and trading, on infrastructure, on making sure we've got a decent internet system, all that kind of thing. It's a huge supply side agenda that goes with it. But all these things fit together into a sort of jigsaw where you need all the pieces. Unless you've got them all there, it just won't happen. So I think it's a huge, very exciting agenda potentially for a Labour government with a lot of upsides and a lot of increase in living standards, as well as better public services on the back of a better performance by the economy. But you need all these three elements in place to make it happen.
John, obviously we've seen the fourth year decline in manufacturing, if you like. We've seen the shift towards services that you mentioned, partly due to neglect and partly due to design at different times. Do you think now with Brexit and the Conservatives' levelling up agenda, and obviously the way that coronavirus has exposed our weakness in terms of our supply chains and so on, do you think there is a political shift now towards your way of thinking?
Well, I think people are much more conscious of the fact that we've got a very weak manufacturing base as a result of what happened with coronavirus. I mean, the fact that we were simply incapable of producing the PPE that people wanted, that we couldn't produce ventilators, we had no testing capacity, really sharply brought home the contrast between the way we run our economy and the Germans, for example. So I think there is more of a mindset. I think also the fact that the coronavirus has obviously really depressed the British economy. We've got a big recovery program, plus the costs that I mentioned earlier on of climate change and social care and health and all these other issues. I think people are really beginning to realize that there's a crisis looming up unless we do something about it, and that more radical changes are required than the Conservatives are talking about at the moment. I mean, they are talking about levelling up, but unfortunately, I just don't believe the sort of policies they're pursuing are really going to make that much difference. And one of the problems we've got in terms of selling this whole range of policies need to change is that most of the driving force for increased productivity actually is in the private sector, around mechanization and technology and power. And a lot of what the public sector can do in terms of housing and schools and rail and road and public buildings and housing actually doesn't increase the GDP very much. So what we've got to do is to be very careful that we don't rely on public sector initiatives to improve the infrastructure and so forth, which actually won't really cut the mustard in terms of getting GDP up. You need a much more subtle balance between the two to make sure it really happens.
Yeah, and there's probably, sorry, Brendan, there's probably
no, go ahead, Joe.
a real danger, if you like, isn't there, that the left is going to turn the post-pandemic recovery into an argument about whether or not we should pay nurses a bit more, and we'll probably all agree that we should. But if we end up just falling into the trap of just having a debate about kind of how big's the state and so on, then obviously that's not going to cut the mustard in terms of getting growth up and rebuilding our manufacturing and so on. So it feels quite important, doesn't it, that the political debate moves more towards the economics and getting GDP up and so on than just about the public sector, as you say, I think. Yeah, the other thing I want to mention was you mentioned climate change. I know you talk a bit about the green agenda in your pamphlet. Do you think putting the green agenda at and the green industrial revolution, as Labour called it in the last election, at the forefront of industrial policy is the right way to go?
Well, I think the green revolution is very important. I think dealing with climate change is really very important too. But actually getting anything to happen there, if you're going to rely on the private sector to do a lot of it, is back to this question of profitability. And if it is cheaper to make wind turbines in Denmark than it is in the UK, that's what's going to happen. And I think it's really, really important, if we're going to make sure that Labour contributes as well as it should to the green revolution, that what we do is to make it as cheap or cheaper to manufacture the sort of equipment that's required to deal with climate change in the UK and not elsewhere. And going back to your earlier point about paying nurses and doctors and everybody else more, we can't do that unless we can get the GDP to a level which will support it. And I think actually one of the real problems coming out of the coronavirus crisis is that you've got perhaps, pretty well the whole of the public sector and maybe half the private sector still having the same remuneration and living standards being paid out to them as they were before, while you've got another third of the GDP, which is the hospitality sector and travel and bricks and mortar retail and so on, which have been decimated by what's happened, where incomes have absolutely plummeted down. And I think it's going to be quite difficult to readjust incomes across the piece in a fair way, which is going to recognize the huge contribution made by lower paid people and the public sector during the crisis we've just been through, with getting the economy back on its feet again, with remuneration for the other areas of the economy which has been so badly hit. So I think there's going to be some very awkward adjustments here, which will be made much easier if the economy is growing, but are going to be very tough to deal with if far from the economy growing, incomes are going down.
I think, John, the report is absolutely fascinating. And for all of our listeners and subscribers to this podcast, John is one of the most eminent economic thinkers on the centre left, and we'd encourage you to visit the site. It's the John Mills Institute for Prosperity. We're going to publish a link to the site here, and we'll also publish a link to the report. I want to turn now, if I can, to Brexit and the Labour Party's position going forward. Obviously, the Conservatives won the general election in December. They got a very large majority. We lost many of our seats that voted leave. John, just broadly, I mean, how do you think the Labour Party should approach, particularly the next 6 months as we come up to the end of the transition, and then its vision for Britain post December the 31st?
Well, I think Sir Keir Starmer's played his cards very well and carefully over the last few weeks. I mean, he might, particularly with his background, have campaigned for having a big extension for a year or a couple of years and revisiting the whole question, perhaps of Brexit, if not very careful. He hasn't done that. What he has done is to say that the government's got a mandate, the general election went the way it did, and what now needs to be done is for the government to make the best job it can of getting the undertakings they're given to get the exit completed by the end of this year in place. And that seems to me to be the right thing for Sir Keir Starmer to have done, one which we should support. Now, what I do very much hope is that there will be some agreement between the EU and the UK over the coming months. We are running very tight on time, and I think there's quite a possibility that we'll finish up with no agreement on trade, unfortunately. And I do think the EU is taking some really very intransigent stance on all this. There are two major issues outstanding, as you're probably aware. One is around fishing, whether we should effectively freeze the existing regime on fishing for the foreseeable future, which we think is completely unreasonable for a country which is now going to be outside the European Union. And the second is what happens about the level playing field. Should the EU still be able to exercise a fair bit of control about the way we run our economy once we're outside the European Union, which is something which normally never happens with trade agreements. For example, the one with Canada or Mexico or South Korea that have been negotiated recently. So there are some big gaps there. And I think it's quite possible we're going to finish up without an agreement and we'll fall back on WTO terms. Now, will that be a disaster? I don't really think it will be. WTO terms for most manufactured goods are no more than about 2.5% or 3% on average. And that's something that could easily be accommodated by a fall on the exchange rate. What I do think the UK badly needs to do is to get the balance of payments back into better order, and leaving aside anything to do with a lower exchange rate and so on we were talking about earlier on, we clearly need to turn to the rest of the world, which is growing much faster than the EU, to get this done. So there are a lot of initiatives which we can take to try and promote trade and UK sales of UK products all over the world, and this is clearly where we're going to have to be.
John, do you think,
sorry,
just to cut in again, Brendan, do you think I mean, I understand what you're saying about you don't feel that WTO terms are as bad as a lot of commentators are making out. But do you think it's worth taking that risk at the time when coronavirus is dealt such a blow to our economy? And is it not better extending by a year or maybe 2 years in order to negate some of that risk?
Well, I can understand that argument. I think the question really turns on whether you think the situation is actually going to be any easier to negotiate in a year or 2 years' time than it is now. I mean, I think there are some fairly clear issues of principle here as to whether or not we're going to accede to the fishing regime that the EU has been talking about, and whether or not we're going to go along with their level playing field proposals. And the trouble is that I think if these just rumble on for a year or 2 years, all this is going to do is generate more and more uncertainty for businesses. They're not going to know what the final outcome is going to be. And if the decisions are going to be difficult and tough to take at any stage, I think we might as well get them taken as early as possible, so that at least you provide enough certainty, or as much certainty as you can, on the way forward. Is the disagreements with the EU, have they come at an awkward time when we've got the coronavirus issue to contend with as well? Clearly, this is a problem, but I think this is going to be a problem that's going to be there anyway, whatever we do.
John, in terms of, I mean, obviously, if the government keeps to their commitments and we do leave the transition period on December the 31st, the UK is going to be out there and it's got to make its own way in the world. And we were talking earlier on about supply chains and the UK increasing its manufacturing and productivity. At the moment, we are incredibly dependent on countries like China for very cheap goods to be brought over here. In light of COVID-19, in light of what's going on in Hong Kong and all the other issues we know about, what do you think? I know you've done business in China, John. What do you think the UK's relationship with China should be?
Well, I think it should be as even-handed as possible, but I think the problem we've got is that the Chinese are becoming more and more prosperous, more and more self-confident, more and more confident in their way of life, their political system, whereas the West, including the UK, is suffering from the reverse of all these sort of attitude changes. I think we're getting more defensive. We've certainly become more reliant on cheap imports, as you rightly say. And I think if we're going to stand up to China and avoid the sort of encroachments that we're seeing all over the place, I mean, just in terms of trading, in terms of political pressure, the sort of pressure that Chinese students are putting on academic institutions in this country, all this kind of thing, we've just got to perform better. I think one of the reasons for trying to get the UK economy to get its growth rate stepped up is that if we grow at 1% per annum for the next 30 years or something, and China grows at 5 or 6 or 7 or 8% per annum, which I think is quite possible, the change in world power is going to be absolutely enormous. And, are people going to maintain their confidence in liberal democracy if we stagnate and our incomes go down? Whereas you look across the other side of the world, you may have reductions in freedom, but people have got better holidays every year, new car, more opportunities, better schooling. I think people are going to be, views are going to be shaken and transformed by some of this, unless we're very careful. So I think that leaving aside all the issues around paying nurses and so on, there's a much wider issue about our political future, which is going to turn on how well we run our economy compared to what happens in the Far East.
And are you getting a sense, John, that businesses are looking for more protection from unfair practices in China, or do you think they're quite happy to have as open trade as possible with as little government interference?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest single problem that we've got with trading with China, we've got a huge balance of payments deficit with China. They sell, as far as I remember, about 45 billion pounds worth of goods to us every year. We sell about half that amount to them. So, there's a big gap there. As long as that goes on, I think it's very difficult to see how, we can avoid all the pressures that we've been under. I think we're in a very poor position, for example, to exercise much influence on what happens in Hong Kong. We can pass resolutions, but, I think that the Chinese are just going to brush them all on one side. I think that the reputation that different political systems have depends hugely on how successful they've been and are likely to be in the future. And, we're not in good shape in that respect. But I don't think that's because there's anything wrong with liberal democracy. It's because the way the government has run the show has been to hobble British industry. I mean, if you can step back for a second on how we've got there, and I think one of the problems about the British economy is it's dominated to such an extent by the service sector, where actually services aren't terribly price sensitive, nor as high tech for that matter. And what you've therefore got is all the influence from London exercised on the macroeconomic scene by people who don't really care what the exchange rate is, whereas the country really depends actually on manufactured exports and manufacturing for increasing productivity, and that's what gets shafted and decimated as a result of an exchange rate which is too high. And it's this imbalance is really the core of the problem.
It's fascinating stuff, John, and I think it's certainly something Labour and the shadow foreign team and Sir Keir Starmer's going to have to think about, because let's just turn to him for a few minutes. I mean, he became leader in the middle of a global pandemic with a government that had an 80-seat majority and a few weeks ago was at 50 points in the polls. And within a few weeks of him being leader, he's narrowed the Tory lead down from 20-something points to 6, and his own personal approval ratings are now above Boris Johnson's. John, I think he's your MP.
He is my MP.
He was your MP, so you know him relatively well. I mean, how do you rate Sir Keir Starmer's performance so far since becoming leader? I mean, what's he done? I mean, it's obvious what he's done good, but do you think he's played it right at the minute?
I must say, I think he's done a really very, very good job. I mean, he looks really statesmanlike. He looks credible. You know, when you see him on television, you can envisage him being the prime minister. I think the way he's judged the situation generally has been very effective. I think, you know, the forensic way he's tackled problems has been just right. I think the balance he's got between supporting the government but being critical of it is really just where people want to be. And I suspect what will happen is that the ratings will go on going up for Starmer and Keir Starmer and going down for Boris Johnson. And I think it's quite possible that all the rumpus we've been through over the last week or two with Dominic Cummings is going to be a bit like the seminal change that that happened to the polls when we came out of the exchange rate mechanism in 1992. That the confidence in the government is just going to erode and going to be very difficult to replace. And that's Labour's real opportunity for the next general election. I know that's quite a long way away at the moment, but the years slip by. And if you look what happened after 1992, right up to 1997, which is 5 years later, the Conservatives never regained the ground that they lost when we came out of the ERM. And I think that the debacle we've seen last week or two may well have the same impact.
And John, you're very connected to obviously the Leave campaigns and people who voted Leave. Do you think that they feel the same way about the scenario over the last week or so? Because obviously the danger is always that Labour's building up support amongst groups and places that are already supportive of Labour. Do you think Keir's now having cut through with the people who left Labour in 2019, in terms of getting their support back? Do you get any sense of that?
I think there is, and I think that Sir Keir Starmer's judged the situation very well in terms of not supporting having extensions and so on. I mean, I think that's just the sort of thing that a lot of the people up in the north of England who voted Conservative might have said, oh, well, you know, look at them all, they're doing exactly what we said they would. You know, they're not supporting the policies that we agreed at 2016. He's ratting on the ball, we're trying to go for another direction again. He hasn't done that. And I think he's judged that situation very well. Now, if it turns out that the negotiations go very badly, then I'm sure he'll go in on the attack. But I think to leave the Conservatives in the light of the general election with an opportunity to fulfill what they said they were going to do successfully and not to oppose it is the right policy to pursue. And I suspect that's resonating quite well in the north of England. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if there was an election tomorrow that all these seats that fell to the Conservatives, a lot of them would come back again.
Interesting.
Well, we hope so.
Can I sneak in a final little question there, Brendan? So on the
no, you go for it, Joe.
In terms of say Brexit does go through, what Labour clearly needs. Well, sorry, Brexit has gone through, but say we get an agreement by the end of the year with the EU. Labour, we're then we're very much anyway in a post-Brexit world. What should Labour be saying about the opportunities post-Brexit? I mean, I know you've talked about about manufacturing and what we need to do there, but what's the Labour story about our place in the world, do you think, moving forward, and what the opportunities are?
Well, I think come back to what I was saying earlier on. I mean, I think the really crucial thing is to get the growth rate up, to get Labour seen as the party of prosperity and opportunity. I think Labour needs to support the private sector, but it's really pretty well always done that. It needs to complement what the private sector can do in the public sector. I mean, I do think, as I was saying earlier on, there's a load that can be done in terms of education and trading and infrastructure and so on. But it needs to be part of a jigsaw that fits together with all the parts in place. We need to have a competitive currency to make sure that we've got the profitability in prospect. We need to make sure the finance is there, and then we need all the backup too. And I think there's a really very exciting story for Labour to tell, and one which will resonate very, very strongly with the potential Labour voters that we need outside London. And if we want a policy that's going to work, that is going to appeal to the traditional Labour voter that we've got all over the place, plus the new Labour voters and the new sort of working class people coming up who aren't necessarily in industry, but where prosperity and decent public services are very important to them. With a vision to provide all that, I think that's what Labour needs to do.
John, it's been fascinating listening to you. I know you're a very busy man, so thank you so much for coming on this podcast. We will boost it and share it over our pages as we always do. The report I have here just earlier on is the John Mills Institute for Prosperity. The report can be found at instituteforprosperity.org.uk, and I know John's going to be releasing a load more publications as we go along. Listener, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Leave your comments and views, joining the debate, and we hope to see you again next week. So goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Remember,
Thanks, John.
wash your hands, stay safe, stay at home.